Good afternoon and welcome back to Storytime. It's good to have you all with us today as we continue our book, Too Much Salt and Pepper by Sam Campbell in his Wildlife series. Today we continue with Chapter 13, Carol Finds Herself. Individual Responsibility, Nature's Plan. There were three things demanding our attention when we awakened on the morning of Carol's sixth day at the sanctuary. First, the weather had made one of those quick changes characteristic of the North Country. The wind was whipping out of the north. Across the sky, clouds of gray with dark undersides went scurrying, looking like flocks of frightened sheep. We heard the wind whistling through our window screen before we were out of bed, and we knew it was a day for heavier clothes, stirring activity, hot soup, and great fires. Our next discovery was that Salt was gone again. The bread left out for him on the doorstep had not been touched, and the island had that empty feeling. Well might our neighbor start practicing with his whistle, and I might as well get ready for a hurry call just at the most inopportune time. It wouldn't be long before Salt would demand the accustomed ferry service. But our first two discoveries of the morning were quickly forgotten in the third one. Carol was gone too. She did not respond to our calls. Jenny hurried to her tent house. Everything was in good order, but Carol was very much absent. A note was pinned to her pillow, and Jenny brought it to me. Gone to Vanishing Lake, it read in hurriedly written script. Hope I see a bear. Don't wait breakfast for me, please. Love, Carol. Should she have gone alone? Asked Jenny, a little concerned. Do you suppose she can follow that trail? I would rather she hadn't gone, I replied, for I knew that though the wilderness will not hurt you, there are many ways to hurt yourself in the wilderness. However, that trail is quite plain, and she's been over it a number of times. If she doesn't return reasonably soon, we'll search for her. I went to the pier and found that Carol had taken a rowboat. On the mainland, I could see the boat at the shore where she had landed to take the trail. Time tries to be mean on occasions. When there is anxiety present, it likes to drag along. That is the way it seemed this morning. The few minutes we were straightening up the cabin and getting our breakfast seemed hours long. Continually we were looking toward the mainland, hoping to see Carol and her rowboat heading for the island. We called loudly, but the high wind just caught up our voices and swallowed them. It was blowing a gale now. Trees were bending low before the pressure of the wind, and across the lake marched legions of white-capped waves. Clouds charged along barely over the treetops, and there were brief showers of hard-driven cold rain. This was a typical Northwoods day, the kind that gives character to the country. On such a day one feels the rigor of the wilderness, the power of wildness of it. There is a challenge in it. It dares the nature lover to come out, and when he responds it puts the color of health in his cheeks, and brings to him a rugged happiness that is not possible in nature's milder moods. Normally, we love well this sort of challenging day, but with Carol alone in the forest and probably not properly dressed for such conditions, we were much concerned. We could wait no longer. It was time to begin the search. We packed some food and dry clothing in a pack-sack, and in our canoe crossed the now foaming waters to the mainland. Leaving the canoe on the shore near Carol's boat, we walked at a stiff pace down Vanishing Lake Trail. If only she doesn't get frightened, I said, as we hurried along. Nothing will harm her unless she loses her head. And we must not get frightened for her, cautioned Jenny, noting my mounting concern. I smiled and slackened my pace, which had become almost a run. Certainly this was a time for clear and calm thought. Thanks, I said, though I was finding it far easier to be unafraid about myself than it was about someone else. Many times I had been in the forest not knowing just where I was. The thought of fear had never come to me, for I knew well nothing in the woods would harm me, and I knew I would figure out my problem sooner or later. In fact, I have always found a large measure of genuine pleasure in being lost. There is something of a contest in the circumstance, and it gives a feeling of intimacy with the forest. But to think of Carol, who was new to the woods, out there alone on this kind of a day, was taxing my composure. Vanishing Lake Trail offered no evidence that Carol had been over it. The intermittent showers of rain had washed away any tracks that might have been there. We called continually, but our voices were muted by the roar of the wind. Trees were lashing back and forth now, and occasionally we could hear a crash as one of them, unable to stand the strain, fell to the ground. Carol was not at Vanishing Lake, and there was no evidence that she had been there. The little spruce trees along the shore were bending stiffly in the gale, and the small lake was staging a sort of toy-like storm all its own. High overhead, two eagles were having a grand time riding the wind. How we wished that we might have their wings for a few moments to rise and look about the country. It was a futile feeling that confronted us. We could not see, shout, or hear beyond a range of a few yards. Carol might well have been just over the next ridge, and we could not have found her, nor could she have known of our presence. But there was nothing to do but keep searching, small as was the area we could observe. We took up each little side trail, climbed hill after hill, shouted until we were hoarse, but all we heard was the voice of the wind. Hour after hour went by, and our search continued. There was a growing seriousness to the situation that we could not deny. Darkness would be coming all too soon. We needed help at once if Carol was to be saved from spending a night in the woods. 2 of us were not enough to search effectively such a vast territory. The forest rangers must be notified and a searching party organized. We returned over Vanishing Lake Trail to our canoe and then to the cabin. To reach the ranger station, we must cross a long stretch of rough water to the place where our car was stored, and then drive 7 miles over a forest road. An axe must be taken along, for it was very possible that trees might have been blown across the road. Before beginning this journey, I changed to dry clothes and made ready for long hours in the forest. Rain had ceased for the time, but the wind blew stronger than ever. Poor Carol, of all days in the year, she would have to be lost on this one. I had left the cabin to begin my journey alone. Jenny remained to receive Carol in case the child succeeded in returning by herself. As I walked toward the pier, I heard a tiny sound that suggested the squeak of some distant gate. I called to Jenny to help me listen. Even above the gale, we heard the sound again. No question about it, there was something in the air other than the many voices of the wind. And it wasn't the squeak of a gate. Fweet, 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 came the unwelcome but commanding whistle from my neighbor's cabin. Oh no, cried Jenny, not that. At a time like this, Salt can wait this once. But the whistle insisted. Fweet, 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 and then it gave a series of short, quick toots that certainly indicated a desperate state of affairs. Surely, the language of that whistle was such as demanded a response. I'll have to go, I said resignedly. I can do it quickly. But what do you suppose that porcupine has done now? Probably chewed the back door off their cabin, or maybe he has eaten his way right down through the roof. While the insistent whistle continued its commanding message, I got into a boat and rowed over hill after hill of high waves. I was so busy at the oars I seldom looked ahead, knowing well the course to my neighbor's pier. And as I neared the shore, where I was protected somewhat from the wind, I heard the expected honk, 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 honk. I answered back in porcupine language. Again came the honk, 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 but this time it was followed by an outburst of merry laughter. Now Salt can do many things that surprised me, but he couldn't do that. I turned quickly in my seat to find Carol standing there, buried deeply in the folds of a much oversized raincoat. Honk, 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 she was calling along with laughter. I'll bet I look like a porcupine at that. My own joy at seeing her could not be restrained. Standing up in the boat and beating my breast in Tarzan fashion, I gave the old Northwoods war whoop, which is reserved for such exultant moments. Wahoo! The sound bounded down the shores, even above the roar of the wind. Jenny heard it, and with the aid of the binoculars learned what was happening. Carol, you blessed child, I exclaimed with what breath I had left. How in the world did you get here? She came out of the woods, my neighbor was calling from his half-opened door. Just the way that pesky porky comes. And if you would just as soon, we would much rather she keep coming than he. She doesn't chew our door sill, and she doesn't scratch on the screen. They were so nice to me, Carol was saying as we got into the boat and rowed away. They took me in before their fire and cooked a hot lunch for me. I don't blame Salt for liking to go there. Carol looked about as bedraggled as when I had fished her out of the lake all on her all too numerous dunkings. Her hair was twisted about like tangled rope, and her clothes, somewhat dried by our neighbor's fire, were a nondescript pattern of wrinkles and mud. But Carol, I said, much puzzled, how did you get there? That is a long way from Vanishing Lake. There are swamps and no trails that lead that way. It was too windy to carry on much conversation as we crossed the lake, and our reunion was too joyous and noisy for explanations immediately. However, in the course of time, we got Carol's version of her experience. She had followed the trail to Vanishing Lake all right, going out just about dawn. There hadn't been much wind when she had started, just enough to make the forest talk mysteriously. She had seen several rabbits as she hiked along. There was a porcupine in a tree, and she had called to it, hoping it might be Inky, or perhaps the long missing Pepper. But she had received no response. There was a deer drinking at Vanishing Lake, and of course this must be Babette, she insisted. And there was a long little animal built like a dachshund that darted the length of a fallen log not 10 feet from her. A weasel, Carol, I said. It was a cute weasel then, insisted Carol. The creature had paused for just a moment and looked at her in a rather friendly manner before he disappeared in the brush. But beautiful as was the experience, she had begun thinking of breakfast. She ate some malted milk tablets she had brought along, but they were an unsatisfactory substitute for breakfast, or perhaps Jenny's special pancakes. She rose to return to the cabin, but decided to take another trail. Another trail, I questioned. Why, Carol, there isn't another trail. But I found one, she declared. It was a small one and wound around a lot, but I could follow it, at least for a way. Carol, 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 that was a deer trail. Yes, a deer trail. These animals have their paths through the forest, and for generations they go over the same route. Their tiny hooves wear a deep rut, and the trail becomes as well defined as if it were made by human feet. However, it is well not to follow their paths, for deer do not necessarily wish to go where we do, so their trails may well lead us astray. That is just what this one did, agreed Carol, her eyes dancing with excitement at recalling the adventure. It circled around hillsides, and sometimes there were several branches. I always took the one that seemed to be the most used. Carol had followed the trail without knowing what direction it was taking until she found herself on the margin of a tangled swamp. The trail was quickly lost in crisscross logs, moss, and massed cedar trees. She realized she could not get through, so she turned about and went back to the top of the little hill, and there sat on a comfortable log to think things out. Here she could see beyond the swamp. She decided to circle the swamp on the high land and pick up the trail on the other side. It took her some time to do this, really longer than she had figured, but at last she came upon a well-defined trail again. Then suddenly she realized she was standing beside the very log on which she had been resting before she started this maneuver. She had circled the swamp completely without finding another trail, and had at last returned to her starting place. Then, for a few moments, she was frightened. The realization came that she was lost. Now the first rain was falling, and she had brought along only a light jacket. The wind was increasing, and she said the whole woods were saying boo at her. She had been wanting to see a bear. Now she was afraid she would see one. And she confessed that there were a few tears flowing. But I tried to remember all that you have taught me, she said. The adventure was all joy now. I remembered that there wasn't anything in the woods that would hurt me. I remembered that you said we must learn to be quiet, and I sat right there and prayed until I felt all calm inside. Something happened within me. Carol paused for a moment as if seeking a way to explain something that was hard to put into words. But she brushed past the matter, declaring that she wasn't afraid any more. She started to figure things out. She declared over and over again that she could solve the problem. She recalled that Vanishing Lake was west of the cabin. Therefore, if she went east, she would come to the shore of our lake. But which way was east? There was no sun to give her the slightest hint. She tried to recall some of the woodcraft stunts she had read in outdoor books. There was something about moss growing on the north side of a tree, but when she looked at the trees near her, the moss was about even all around. Just as well she hadn't trusted that one. Like most of the storybook woodcraft, this sign is unreliable. On the south side of the hill, where there are few trees and the sun can shine on their trunks, the moss would grow thickest on the north side of the trees, since it likes shade. But conditions make this undependable. Only one sign Carol could have relied upon had she known it. The topmost branch of an uninjured hemlock tree points east. But one must know a hemlock tree, and must be sure it is uninjured before one can trust that pointing finger. If the sun were shining, she might have pointed the hour hand of her watch toward the sun. Halfway between the hour hand and the shortest distance to 12 o'clock would have been approximately south. But Carol had figured out something that was of greater help under the prevailing conditions. It occurred to her that as she had walked back to Vanishing Lake, the wind was striking her right side. Hence, if she walked now so that it struck her left side, all the while she would be retracing her steps. She adopted this course and held to it. "Fine thinking, Carol," I complimented her. "Excellently done. You were fortunate that the wind didn't change, though." She realized this, but felt certain such a strong wind would not change suddenly. From then on, her story was one of travel difficulties. She had continued on her wind-directed course regardless of obstacles. Sometimes she was in swamps, sometimes in dense brush-filled areas, sometimes among tall pines where the walking was relatively easy. She remembered the caution against hurry and walked at an easy pace, resting when tired. Several times she had stopped to call, but realized her voice would not carry far. Finally, she came to the shore of the lake not far from our neighbor's cabin. And do you know, she said, still quivering with excitement at her adventure, I was a little bit sorry when I found out where I was. It had been grand working it all out, and again she paused for want of words. For a moment her eyes became distant and her lips relaxed in a strong smile. I felt as if there were something very vital in her story which we were not getting. This child had had an adventure deeply impressive and with an edge of danger to it. She hadn't just blundered through it, she had thought her way through it. Great things happen to people in times like that. Carol, said I, do you remember what thoughts came to you when you sat on that hill? I mean, just before you got the idea of letting the wind guide you back. Was there something that impressed you a great deal? Carol flashed a look at me that was almost reticent. The smile died from her lips, but there was an expression in her eyes that was rich with deep feeling. Yes, she said, but again she hesitated. Can you tell us? Asked Jenny, drawing her chair near and taking the child's hand in hers. I wonder if I can, said Carol. We sat in silence as she tested her thoughts and searched for a way to express them. You see, when I first realized I was lost, I felt pretty helpless, she said. Always I had had someone to ask about problems, someone to figure them out. But now there was no one. I told you I prayed. I prayed long and hard. Then for a few moments I just sat there quietly looking around. A strange feeling crept over me. I realized I wasn't the only one that was lost. Some part of all those who loved me was lost too. You people, my parents, my friends. If anything happened to me, it would hurt everyone. I shouldn't have gone alone on that trail. I knew it. It wasn't fair to you, and I knew I had to get out of the woods not only because of myself, but because of everyone. I felt responsible, I suggested. That's it. I felt responsible. I simply had to win. I prayed some more, and while I was praying, the last bit of fear left me. It was the strangest feeling. I knew that I was all right and that I could do the right thing. I was so sure of it, I laughed at the rain as it beat in my face. When the wind blew hard, I dared it to blow harder, and it seemed to me... She hesitated again and bit her lip. You won't laugh at me, will you? She asked. Of course not, I assured her. We are grateful if you will share your experience fully with us. We are learning something by this. Well, she continued, it seemed to me that this wasn't being lost at all. I actually felt as if I had been lost all my life, and this experience was finding myself. I was directly in touch with real things. There was no one else to turn to solve things for me, and I was dealing with nature firsthand. Do you know what I mean? We knew very well what she meant. Who has not stood at that glorious moment when it seems that God himself has called him by name and directed him to do an important task? It seemed to me, Carol was saying, that there was no more important thing in the world to be done than for me to get out of that woods. And what made me happy was that I was the only one who could do it. It was my job. I just knew I could do it, and now, she gave a delighted little laugh, now I know I can do anything that God asks you to do, Jenny finished the sentence to Carol's satisfaction. And so, Carol, in your hours in the woods, trying though they may have seemed, you saw that great truth, which all nature reflects and which we must all understand. It is individual responsibility. Nature grows, evolves on that plan. Here about us lies that great forest, useful, beautiful, a boon to the whole earth. But it was only a good forest because every tree in it was being the finest tree that could grow where it grew. Every tree and shrub was giving its all to growing. Nature would accept no less. No tree could wait upon its neighbor. It could not say, if others will grow, I will too. Otherwise I won't. Nature works on the perfection of the individual, and because each tree was doing its best, accepting full responsibility for living, doing, and growing with all its power, the forest is strong and beautiful. Nothing that lives is excused from this law of nature. Every creature is being the best one of its kind that he can be. He is solving his problems or rising to conditions. Even the common grass blade or the lowly dandelion is forever devoting all his power to growth, being the best plant of its kind that could grow where it grows. This is the principle on which the universe is built. Evening came early. The wind moderated somewhat, but still blew at a lively pace through the gathering darkness, playing a strong symphony on the pines. Daytime clouds broke their solid array, and soon stars were peeking between their dark forms. The moon rose and plated the fluffier ones with silver. The day had been filled with so much thought that Carol felt we should see wise old Inky before bedtime. We paddled to the mainland accordingly and started toward the salt lick, but long before we had reached Inky's realm, we came upon a good-sized porcupine in the middle of our trail. The creature was not in the least disturbed by our presence or our inquisitive flashlight. Obviously, it was not large enough to be old Inky, yet it showed definite interest in us. Jenny gave the little porcupine call. The animal answered. "Do you suppose it is Pepper?" asked Jenny excitedly as she continued calling the porky in its own language. The creature answered again. It raised on its hind feet and shook out its quills. Then, with a sudden abandon, it began whirling about in a dance of toughness. "It is Pepper!" cried Jenny as the three of us moved forward toward the happy creature. And then it made a move that removed all doubt. Breaking out of its whirling dance, it made a dash for me, wrapped all 4 feet around my leg, and bit sharply into my knee. That was Pepper's old stunt. A wild porcupine would never do that. This was our pet, who had now been absent for over 3 months. At the cost of 6 quills embedded in my hand, I took the enthusiastic animal from my leg and tussled her about on the ground. She always had been rough in her play, and her long life in the woods had not made her any more gentle. For a few minutes we had a right lively time keeping her over-cordial and affectionate greeting from scarring us for life. Then she literally danced her way off into the dark brush, as if to say she was glad to see a little of us, but didn't want too much. The 3 of us stood laughing and calling after her for some time. It was good to know for certain that she was still around and had not forgotten us. We moved on to the salt lick. The cake of salt was well worn now, and the stump below it was deeply cut by Inky's persistent chewing, aided no doubt by Pepper. Perhaps Salt and other porcupine visitors. We had not long to wait for Inky that night. We heard his little grunt of greeting back in the forest in response to our call. It had been several nights since we had visited him, and perhaps he was just a little bit lonesome. However, he always acted so self-sufficient and utterly indifferent to us that it was difficult to know whether we were very important to him or not. Now he appeared in the rays of our flashlights, walking along with his head to the ground as if his great load of quills were about all he could carry. "Inky knows individual responsibility, doesn't he?" said Carol, her own experience still vivid in her thoughts. "Bet he didn't have to get lost to learn it either." Inky was close to our feet by this time. He took the cookie Carol offered him, although he always had a way of taking such things that made us think he was doing us the favor. He ate a few bites of the delicacy, and then with utter disdain dropped the rest on the ground and stood looking up at us. Carol stooped and stroked his head. He tried to make a playful bite at her hand, but she had learned well how to avoid him. "I believe he will talk tonight," said Carol with a wink at me. "He just looks like it." Yes, Inky looked as if he would talk. Perhaps it is because we know noise is so empty and meaningless that we believe everything silent is made up of deeper wisdom. Inky was doubly silent that night. He did not indulge in his little grunts, and he did not dance. He just sat there looking at us, blinking a bit of the lights and occasionally scratching an itchy spot with either fore or hind foot. I sat on the ground before him, and he came forward and put his front feet in my lap, and then, with a little groan of relaxation, he lay down contentedly. "Is he talking now?" asked Carol, tempting me. "Jenny and I can't hear away over here." "Well," said I, "if you can't hear him, then he is talking." I looked down in the old porcupine's face, wishing I could give up to repose as easily and as completely as he did. Inky yawned cavernously, started to scratch back of one ear, and then gave it up as too much trouble. "Sammy, old boy," he seemed to be saying, "I want to add a bit to the things you've been learning today." "All right, Inky, go ahead. We'll just skip the question as to how you know that we've been learning anything." "This business of individual responsibility," he paused, and looked up to see if I were impressed by his use of such enormous words. "This individual responsibility has got a catch to it where you people are concerned. Your job is a bit bigger than ours. We forest people don't have any choice. We just have to obey the law. Every last one of us has got to be the best one he can all the time. We don't know anything else. Same is true of plants and trees. They just have to keep growing their best, and there isn't anything inside of them that says, 'What do you want to do that for? Why should you do everything that is right when maybe others won't be doing their part?' That is where you human beings are handicapped. You've got a funny ability to doubt and to make choices. Most all of you really know that you ought to live under the same law as the forest. You would have a mighty swell world if each one of you would just be the finest fellow you can be. But there you start doubting and questioning. You think that is so blamed smart, and yet it's your biggest problem. You wouldn't want us to stop reasoning things out, would you, Inky? I put in. No, I don't mean that. Inky changed his position and yawned again. It's good to reason things out, but you folks don't always reason. You just fear. When you folks when the little voice of wisdom says inside you, you gotta be the finest human being you can be, you say, well, okay, but what about the rest of these folks? If I follow that pattern and the others don't, they will take advantage of me. And you all go along doing lots that is wrong while you believe you would do what is right if everyone would. Now, Sammy, the world doesn't work that way. Take that old hemlock tree of mine, for instance. If it was the only tree in the world, it would still be the best tree it knows how. If you could take all the rest of the trees away, and sometimes it looks as if you people meant to do just that, it wouldn't get mad, resentful, mean, and just quit trying. It would keep on growing as if the whole world depended on it alone. Now that is what you call individual responsibility, I suggested. Thanks, said Inky. I just wanted to see if you knew. Inky rose, shook his quills, and looked into the darkness. I knew his moves. Our visit was about over. He raised on his hind legs and reached up with twitching nose. Carol offered him another cookie, but he wasn't interested. He hadn't quite finished his silent oration. Listen, folks, he said, though I am sure Jenny and Carol did not hear him, as they were listening to some sound out in the forest. You people are kind of pathetic. You want to be rid of your troubles, your politics, poverty, wars, and such things, and you try one thing after another that doesn't work, when your only way is nature's way. A long time ago someone said as much to you, and you didn't listen. It was something about doing your own work, minding your own business, or something about salvation. Work out your own salvation, I helped Inky out, for to this end God works with you. By balsam juice, that's the one. Boy, if you'd only learn to do that, you'd straighten yourselves out in a hurry. We forest folk have known that for ages. Boy, oh boy, it's a swell world when anyone can work out his own starvation. Salvation, Inky, I corrected. Okay, whatever you call it. It's a swell world when everybody can get busy at that business of finding his own happiness, and that way help others to find theirs. And that reminds me, I didn't do a very good job of chewing on that cedar tree today. Gotta get busy. So long. And with sudden animation, he went scampering into the forest. Wish I had listened more closely, said Carol, as I repeated Inky's conversation on the way home. He has something when he says, you can be happy in working out your own salvation. For I had a wonderful time today working out mine. Hope you enjoyed the story today. Join us again tomorrow, same time, same place, for Chapter 14, A Porky and a Young Punk. Good afternoon, and God bless.